Now, what that phrase did, what Ellis did was with that phrase, was to shift the focus of therapy from unconscious drives in our childhood, like the Oedipus complex or the death complex, to focusing on a person's thoughts and beliefs in the present and how they give rise to their emotions and colour their experience of reality. Now, Ellis called this the ABC theory of emotions. Some of you guys will be aware of it. ABC, it stands for A is the activating event, B is the belief you use to interpret that event, and then C is the emotion, the consequent emotion that comes from that. So he started kind of coming up with these ideas and saying at conferences and in papers, look, you know, psychoanalysis doesn't work. And he didn't just say it mildly and quietly, he said it very aggressively. He'd stand up at conferences and say, you know, Freud's ideas are horseshit from start to finish. You know, he said, Freud doesn't know what he's talking about, he's a charlatan, this is like the emperor's new clothes. And, you know, he went down very badly. He got thrown out of conferences, he got banned from academic boards. You know, he was kind of a pariah. And they said, who are you to criticize this great European intellectual? I mean, you were a traveling pants salesman. Freud wrote these great books called things like, you know, Civilization and Its Discontents, or Totem and Taboo. And Ellis wrote books called things like How to Stop Feeling Miserable About Anything. Yes, anything. I mean, like, it sounded so kind of trashy. And so they said, you're just a self-help guy. You're not really a great thinker. But, you know, he said, yeah, but my ideas really work. And what's more, I can make people better in about 8 weeks. I don't need to see them for years. They don't need to spend loads of money. I can make them better in 8 weeks. They might not even have to see a therapist to get better. And that really terrified everyone. The idea that they weren't necessary. And so while this controversy was happening, while Ellis was kind of being thrown out of psychology and being a pariah, there was another psychologist, very different, working at Penn, you know, what's called Penn University in Philadelphia. A guy called Beck, very different to Ellis, quietly spoken, polite, an establishment guy, you know, academic, always wore a bow tie, never swore, yeah. But beneath all that kind of mild-mannered exterior, this guy was a rebel as well, and he was also trained in psychoanalysis. And he was also thinking, you know, this isn't working. I mean, there's, you know, not much is happening here. These people don't seem to be getting better. And like Ellis, he had read a lot of ancient philosophy. He'd actually, you know, studied it at university, unlike Ellis, he'd actually studied it. And he heard about Ellis's ideas, and he started to look at the Stoics as well, and he started to look at Plato, and how you can, you know, and to address the role that thoughts and beliefs play in giving rise to emotions. And both Ellis and Beck invented a new style of therapy, where before, you know, the patient would be, the therapist would be sitting here, the patient would be lying down there. They wouldn't really talk, and the patient was just looking up and just talking about their childhood. What they both did was they sat the patient up opposite them, and they engaged them in a dialogue. And Beck called this the Socratic Method. So it was about, you know, really getting them, you know, challenging them. So that the patient would say, you know, I went to the supermarket the other day, this guy really browned me off. And say, well, why? What happened? What was going through your head? He'd say, well, it was the way he looked at me. It was like, you know, he didn't like me. Well, why does that matter, that he doesn't like you? Well, I don't know, because, you know, so really kind of getting the patient to think about how they interpret the world and to challenge their beliefs and to say things like, the same kind of questions Socrates was saying. Why do you think that? Does that make sense? Is that rational? Is that logical? You know, how does that help you? So it wasn't just the Stoic Socrates, but also the skeptic Socrates, because they'd also ask, well, where's the evidence for that? You know, someone would come into therapy and say, yeah, well, nobody likes me. Well, where's the evidence for that? Are you sure about that? You know, we look for the evidence. So, you know, they were influenced as much in a way by skepticism as they were by Stoicism. And what Beck did, which no other therapy had really done at that point, and which Stoicism hadn't really done in the ancient world, was that he subjected this therapeutic ideas and techniques to testing. You know, he subjected them to trials, scientific trials, to see if they really worked. And so he subjected what was being called cognitive therapy to many randomized controlled trials, you know, scientific trials, and he found that it really did work. You know, that after 8 weeks of cognitive therapy, about 60% of people recovered from depression. About 55% of people recovered from social anxiety. About 60% of people recovered from post-traumatic stress disorder. And it helped people with alcoholism, it helped people with bulimia, insomnia, chronic pain, all these kind of different things. So, you know, they both took the ideas and the techniques of Stoicism and tested them out and found that they really worked. And it wasn't just, you know, the Stoics' theory of the emotions that they took from Stoicism, not just the cognitive theory of emotions. It was also some of the Stoics' therapeutic techniques. Things like using a journal, for example. It's a very important part of CBT. You write down your thoughts, your habitual thoughts, you become aware of them, and then you work to challenge them. So that's an important part of both Stoicism and CBT. Things like training your attention to the present moment. Not just kind of going over the past and complaining about the past, but bringing your attention back. What are you thinking now? Taking responsibility for the present. There's a line from Seneca, which is very relevant for both Stoicism and CBT. He says, "What is the good of dragging up sufferings that are over, of being unhappy now just because you were then?" I mean, that's one of the key differences between Stoicism and CBT and psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis would say, yeah, let's drag it up. You know, spend as long as you want, spend years dragging up the sufferings of the past. And Stoics are like, why do that? Why make yourself unhappy just because your parents made you unhappy, you know? So what happened was, because they built up this large body of evidence, which no other therapy had really done, then governments started to become interested in CBT and started to think about how they could provide CBT to their citizens, how they could roll it out, you know, through public policy. This has only really happened in the last kind of 3 or 4 years that you've started to see this kind of Stoic influence politics arise. One of the big steps forward was in the UK. A guy called Lord Layard, who's an economist from the London School of Economics. He started to look at the problem of mental illness in Britain. It's a big problem there, like it is in America. Something like 1 in 4 people suffer from a mental illness in the UK. Depression it affects millions of people, and it costs governments a lot of money because they have to pay for incapacity benefits. That costs billions. And they also have to pay for prescription drugs, for Prozac and so on, and that costs billions for years and years. So he said, he kind of came across CBT, and he said, well, this is great, this therapy really works, it only takes 8 weeks, why don't we provide more of this? Let's reduce the waiting list for therapy from like 2 years to, let's say, 6 weeks. Let's get everyone access to this kind of therapy, and then we can save ourselves loads of money and reduce suffering. Layard isn't a Stoic at all. He's a utilitarian. He doesn't really know that CBT comes from Stoicism, even though he's responsible for it reaching millions of people. But anyway, he managed to get the British government to pass this new policy just in 2007, that they were going to put in something like £180 million and train 3,500 new therapists, CBT therapists. It's called Improved Access to Psychological Therapies. I mean, he didn't brand this policy very well. He called himself the Happiness Tsar. And then he wrote a book called Happiness, Lessons from a New Science. And he's just started up a new think tank called the Movement for Happiness. So he's really banded around this word happiness so often, it sounds like, you know, he's on laughing gas or something. It sounds like something from The Sound of Music. And it made him quite an easy target for his critics, because they're just like, you're just talking about happiness and positivity all the time. There's no rigor to it. And in fact, there was an article in the Daily Mail, the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, just last month, and it said that British Stoicism is dead. He said, you know, that we've lost our tolerance for discomfort and suffering. And the journalist gave us evidence for this, the fact that we've become a nation of pill poppers that are just doing Prozac all the time. And he said, you know what, we even have like a movement for happiness now, and a happiness Tsar. And he didn't realise, of course, that this guy, Lord Layard, is responsible for Stoic ideas reaching millions of people in Britain. So this guy is probably the key figure in the revival of Stoicism in Britain. But it's because he's branded it as happiness, rather than, you know, resilience or grit or something else. You know, so it's all about the word you choose in some ways. So, anyway, so that's kind of brought Stoic ideas and techniques into the health sector, into like general practice, and you know, because now you can get it on the NHS. You can go to the NHS and go to see one of these 3,000 therapists, and they'll teach you these kind of Stoic ideas and techniques.